All right, we are live. Joining me today, as usual, an extra special guest. Today we have Jake Quilty-Dunn, who I'm very excited to talk to. So, Jake, I wonder if you could just tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do before we get started.
Sure. I'm an assistant professor of philosophy and cognitive science at Rutgers. And my work is generally about mental representation, what the kinds of data structures are in the mind, how we use them in perception and thought, how this relates to things like belief and inference and imagery and sometimes consciousness.
Sometimes consciousness. Well, we'll try to get to some consciousness related things maybe before the end of this, but there's a lot of to deal with in that first bit. So I think your work is very exciting and very cool because as you point out in some places, there hasn't really been as much focus by philosophers on sort of the mental vehicles or like the nature of representations. And we've been largely focused on the nature of content, as you lament in various places. So it is nice to see people sort of returning to this older debate about a quote unquote older debate about the nature of mental vehicles. Is that the right way that you sort of would frame your work here?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think like kind of philosophy of mind in the 70s and 80s was more focused on the mental vehicle type stuff. So all those discussions of the language of thought, and then it kind of moved into theories of content. Somewhere Jerry Fodor says, I think it's in the essay Propositional Attitudes at the very end of it, he says, it seems to me that the content of philosophy of mind for now is pretty much just focused on how the symbols get their content. Like that's the main question for us going forward. And then that kind of was for a while.
Right.
And then philosophers were just interested in different kinds of content. But as someone who was in grad school in the 2010s, I felt kind of disillusioned by these debates about non-conceptual content and things like that. And I just felt the word content was thrown around in all these different ways.
Hmm.
And in ways that where it was hard to even see how evidence could move people in one direction or another. And so I thought there are these old kind of unsettled questions about the form that the representations themselves actually take, like image like, sentence like, language of thought, other kinds of ideas there. And in that case, I thought it was a lot easier to see how you could really marshal evidence to directly support or critique some of these views. And so that was definitely a goal of mine, was to move towards talking about the vehicles rather than the contents of mental representations.
Yeah, that's very cool. And it's nice to see the language of thought being brought back to the center and being argued for as opposed to, dismissed or like some people have had the attitude maybe was superseded by the advancements in AI. So it's really nice to see you guys trying to make the case that it's still an important thing in cognitive science.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. So I want to, a lot of this, so before we actually get into some question about your actual view, is kind of setting the stage here. Because what you're after is to defend a version of what we might call pluralism, what you do call pluralism, actually, about these kinds of vehicles. So I wonder if you could just tell us a little bit about what your overarching view is before we get into the specifics.
Sure. I mean, one kind of view you might have is that all mental representation is ultimately in one kind of code or one form. And I think arguably you see something like this in some of the classical British empiricists. So I think Berkeley would be a good example, maybe Hume, where mental representations or ideas are all images. And so, there are differences between images in different modalities. So there are format differences, even for that kind of a extreme empiricist view.
Mhm.
But ultimately, everything is just a copy of a perceptual imagistic representation. And then the kind of extreme opposite of that view would be a more rationalistic view where everything in the mind is abstract and logically structured in some
Mhm.
lingua franca language of thought. And it seems to me like which computational, so like the point of having representations in a particular format is that they make information available in a way that's explicit for some purposes and not for others. So, for example, if you're trying to figure out whether two points that are being represented in space lie on the same line, then polar coordinate system is going to be a much easier format for that than a Cartesian coordinate
Mhm.
system. if they lie on a line that's diagonal to the origin, right? And then there are other things that are going to be more easily recovered if it's represented in a Cartesian coordinate system. So thinking about representational formats like that, it becomes pretty clear that if the mind is up to a lot of different things computationally,
Mhm.
then it's very likely going to represent information in lots of different formats and potentially even redundantly, like representing the same piece of content in multiple different formats for different computational purposes. And so that has always seemed to me like just very plausible as a general hypothesis about complex mental systems that they're not gonna have one unitary format. And so I think that this turns out to be true, not just in thinking, where it seems really plausible that there are both imagistic and non-imagistic kinds of representations in thinking, but even just in visual perception.
Right. So the kind of Hume-Berkeley view that you were alluding to would be the view that there's like image-like ideas that are representations, but then concepts really are just like copies of those, less vividly or something like that. So that really all there are like images and associations between them. That would be the kind of thing that on the left side being very extreme, one kind of format.
Mhm.
Yeah, and even with Berkeley, right, you don't even get these abstract ideas. Every image can function in different ways. So you want to reject that. Now, I know there still are some current defenders of that view. But what is your feeling about like how prevalent or like, because it sort of seems to me, I'm on your side, that I sort of think it's obvious that there's going to be these different formats. And the people that I think of, like you could think of a few like prominent examples of people on the other side, like Prince, for example, I would say maybe, and Peacock maybe in various places. But aren't or let me ask this: isn't it the case that most cognitive science or philosophers interested in this kind of take this kind of as written that there's multiple formats?
I think so. Although your sociological judgments here are going to be so dependent on your little pocket of cognitive science, because sometimes people say things like nobody believes in mental representations
Yeah,
anymore, and
exactly.
we've that the whole approach has been superseded, and so I don't want to make a super general claim about what people believe, but I do think yeah, most philosophers are open to this. They might not be open to particular formats like the language of thought, but I think most philosophers do agree that there is a difference in the form of representation involved in seeing something and thinking about it in a more abstract way.
Right. Okay. So yeah, I didn't mean to get too sociological. I was just curious about like the people you talk
Yeah.
to. Do they generally tend to be polarized in this way, or is that sort of like a remnant of history? This kind of all or none sort of view.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So, because people like Ned, I think Ned Block, they count as pluralists as well, right? Even though they think there's this hard line border between perception and cognition, they still think that he still thinks there's different formats that are involved. So he would be a pluralist in your sense or not, is I guess what I'm asking.
Yeah, for sure. About the mind in general, Ned Block would definitely be a pluralist. And someone who's in favor of the language of thought hypothesis, I think, as I
Hmm.
read him. But he also thinks that there are imagistic representations or iconic representations. For him, the pluralism kind of stops at the border between perception and cognition. So, like, once you get into perception, it's all iconic.
Hmm.
And that's what grounds the difference between perception and cognition is that perception is a class of mental processes that can only deal in iconic format, whereas cognition can exploit a variety.
So would you want to reserve then the term pluralism for the more restricted view that perception itself has multiple representational formats, or are you happy to have it extend to these border enforcing types as well?
I'm happy to be pluralist about who counts as a pluralist. But yeah, I mean, in a one paper of mine, I call this view about perception perceptual pluralism, that like you have a pluralist view about the formats of perception, but you can definitely be extremely pluralist about representational formats generally, but also think that differences between formats in some cases provide a ground for distinctions between different systems or types of processes, and that's I think Ned is a particularly robust form of that kind of view because he thinks that's the essence of the perception cognition border.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Interesting. And one just question about something you said a second ago was that you were mentioning people like Berkeley and Hume and saying that they endorse the idea that there's different formats. And I'm wondering if you, in your, because you kind of some in some places technically want to distinguish format from vehicular properties, so that you could
Mm.
have two sentences of English that are in the same format but have different syntactic structures, therefore different vehicle properties. So, with a distinction like that, would we look back and on that previous comment and say, well, actually, there's not different formats in Barclay; there's just different vehicular properties, or is that not the
Yeah,
view?
that's a good question. I mean, I kind of think if you have two different sentences, they definitely have they can have very different syntactic structures. Um, but those differences are fall within one representational system that like tells you what the set of allowable structures are within that system, even if, as in the case of language, it's arguably unbounded.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so in that case, you can have two different syntactic structures that fall within the same format because they're generated by the same compositional principles. So the way that I think about a format is it's a set of compositional principles and primitive representation types. So in the case of a language, and a simple way of thinking about it, the primitive representation types would be given by the lexicon, like all the primitive meaningful units for the language. And then you have the grammar, which tells you what the combinatorial rules are for combining those into more complex bits, or taking those bits and combining them into more complex structures. So you could have two very different token structures that are both coming from the same lexicon and grammar, and so are the same format. And I was thinking if you are a classical empiricist, you might want to say that the primitives and compositional principles for vision could be, for the images in vision, could be different than the primitives and compositional principles for touch.
Hmm.
And so that would give you two actually different formats, even if they both have some superordinate format category in common, like they're both iconic.
Mm-hmm.
And I think for someone like Barclay, that's kind of important because for Barclay, you, just as an example, at least as some people read him, vision is not inherently three-dimensional,
Right.
and you only get three-dimensional content from touch, and then you get associations between touch and vision that allow you to access three-dimensional shape through vision. But there's a kind of inherent format boundary there, and it's only through cross-associating them that you're able to represent stuff that you couldn't before.
Yeah, that's the way I traditionally would have read Barclay. So I resonate with that, but I know it's
Yeah.
controversial. So that's interesting because, I mean, one thing just as a parenthesis is that I really very much like looking back on these historical figures and reading them as like cognitive scientists interested in the format and structure of the mind and what sort of explanations, as opposed to their, looking at Barclay and talking about idealism, or Hume and talking about skepticism. So, I very much think that that's a worthwhile project, which maybe Fodor started with his little Hume Variations book. But I think it's cool. So, and Barclay spent a lot of time talking about vision and using that as his like basis for discussing his metaphysical views. So I think it's worthwhile to pay attention to them.
Yeah.
So on just to bring this back to what you were saying though, it's like the representational format is then sort of akin to different languages. So that if you have a sentence in French and a sentence in English, are they in the same format on your view or different formats?
Yeah, and that's another good case to think about. I would think they're in different formats, but also the same format at a more superordinate level.
Hmm.
So like being language-like is one kind of format, but there are lots of different ways to be language-like. And in French and English, the differences are probably not even that deep.
Right.
But there are some differences in the grammar for sure, and the lexicon, obviously.
Fine. I should have
So
said Sanskrit. Fine.
yeah, right. And I mean, I guess people will disagree on how different languages really fundamentally are. Like Chomsky, I think, would claim they're not that different,
Right.
ultimately.
It's all
But
merge, man. Merge.
yeah, yeah, that's right. It's all just recursion. But yeah, I mean, the way that I think about it, that format properties can come in different at different levels of specificity. So you could have, for example, there's a great paper from 2013 by Gabe Greenberg in Phil Review called Beyond Resemblance, and he argues against resemblance-based notions of depiction, which I think that's relevant to these format questions we're talking about.
Right.
And that paper has a wonderful set of examples of different kinds of projection rules. And so he talks about like a fisheye lens, like in like a 90s music video, where the projection is like all distorted. And that seems to me like that's a different format of representation than other kinds of projection rules that are more realist. Um, Even though they're both obviously pictorial formats that are at some levels of description the same format.
Uh-huh. So what then should we make of this notion of properties of the vehicle? Is that a different notion than format, or how are those related on your way of thinking?
Yeah, I mean, definitely there's some properties of the vehicle that might not be relevant to format, like how the vehicle is neurally instantiated.
Hmm.
Um, and yeah, I don't really have my views about this are not really that deep. I mean, I do kind of loosely think about formats as general types of vehicle structures.
Hmm.
And so the properties of the vehicle that are relevant to its structure and how it can be combined and so on would count as aspects of format.
Okay. So
But
so roughly like something similar to Fodor's idea that it's the properties that the system is sensitive to for whatever computations it's running.
yeah, yeah, that's right. I mean, but you're gonna want there to be different vehicle properties, like the difference between the concept cat and the concept dog for Fodor, if those are both atomic, unstructured representations in the language of thought. They're going to have to be different vehicles with different vehicle properties that the system is sensitive to.
Right.
It's a little loose to call those different formats, I think.
Yeah.
So if the formats really, when we're talking about the vehicle aspects that are uh, showing up in compositionality in ways that are useful for typing different kinds of structures, that's where I think we find it useful to start talking about format.
Okay. Yeah, very cool. And then I see that we have a comment from the audience, actually, from Victor Barcelos, who's a friend of the channel. But he's asking you, just before we go too deep down the rabbit hole, what are your thoughts on anti-representationalist approaches? I guess we joked about that before we started talking. But yeah, like he mentions Huto and Mayan's radical enactivism. And I sort of, my gut reaction to this was that you do talk in places that there's different levels. So you might have a, connectionist implementation neurally, and then that might give rise to like a language of thought like structure at the higher level. So I wonder if like, is that would you give a similar kind of answer to the anti-representationalist, or would you take a different approach?
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, in the case of connectionism, you can really see how that would work, right? I think that like ultimately every kind of format we're talking about, if it has a role to play in cognitive science, it's got to be instantiated in the brain somehow.
Hmm.
And so there must be assuming that the fundamental aspects of neural information processing are connectionist or something like connectionist, there needs to be a story about how you're going to get implementation in a connectionist network. The anti-representationalist approach seems to me to be much more radically like kind of getting rid of all of this and just saying like we shouldn't, yeah, we can grant that there's physiological stuff going on in the brain, but we shouldn't describe any of it in information processing terms, and we
Hmm.
should just be thinking about things like connections between that and the environment. um, and when it comes to the negative aspect of that approach, which is there are no representations, I think the evidence that there are representations is very strong, and it would be very hard to explain lots of different phenomena in cognitive science without mental representations.
Hmm.
Things like semantic priming, the fact that when you read the word doctor, then 150 milliseconds later you're going to be quicker at recognizing the word nurse than the word bread, even though nurse and bread are matched for frequency and length. What explains that? I think it's going to be very hard to give a causal mechanical explanation of that kind of effect without positing internal representations.
Hmm.
Um, and then there are lots of other kind of bread and butter effects in cognitive science that I feel that way about. But that's not to say that the concepts that are invoked by anti-representationalists are empty or useless or anything like that. That's not how I feel. And so there are a lot of things that can be subsumed within the representationalist approach, things like the Gibsonian concept of affordances,
Yeah.
But and then maybe, it's also useful, I think, sometimes to have irreconcilable research programs running in parallel and discovering things and the dialogue. Like, I don't think science needs to be in agreement to make progress, and probably it's damaging to progress if everyone's in agreement all the time. So
Yeah.
I'm open-minded about that, but I'm not willing to get on board with the anti-representationalism
Okay.
itself.
Would you get on board to the extent that you think that there are some aspects of perception or cognition that could be explained without representations?
Yeah, I think so. I think so. So, uh, I'm willing to accept that there are aspects of information processing
Hmm.
in the visual system, for example, that might not count as full-blown representations. And so if you think about activations in the retina and then the like really early subcortical stages of processing, like the in the LGN and so on, um, we might want to describe that information processing without using representation per
Hmm.
se. We might not want to say that the activation in the LGN is representing some state of affairs out in the world. And so I agree with, for example, Tyler Burge has made this argument like very strongly that he argues you don't get full-blown representation of the world until you get constancy effects.
Hmm.
And so that would mean all the pre-constancy stuff is not really representational. And so maybe there's room for kind of 4E-ish ways of thinking about some of that stuff. But at the very least, yeah, I would definitely want to grant there's stuff in the mind that's not representational. And then also all the different kinds of affect that are present in the mind. I mean, I wouldn't want to assume that that all needs to be reduced to representation.
Hmm. So by affect, you mean specifically emotional valence or some other thing?
Yeah, valence in general,
Okay.
valence and arousal and emotion and that kind of thing. Yeah.
So I don't want to get too distracted here, but I'm wondering, I'm curious now how you would think that would be non-representational.
I mean, you could think that there's just like well, one way to think about it would be to have a kind of view on which it's just phenomenal raw feel
Uh-huh.
stuff that has
Yeah.
a functional role. But that's not how I think about it. And I'm going out on a limb here
Yeah,
because this
sorry.
isn't
I
really
know I didn't
a
mean
topic of no, but
to.
I'm happy to talk about it. I just
Okay.
wanted to flag so that if I say something that like someone who knows the literature is like that doesn't make any sense. I'm not claiming that I've looked into this,
Okay.
but you might have a view on which something like a valence doesn't really say anything about the world. Like think about reinforcement learning, right? Where you come to associate some stimulus with a positive valence through repeated pairing of that stimulus with another positively valenced thing. That's not really reinforcement learning, but it's evaluative conditioning.
Yeah.
Um, it could be that the valence says the thing that it's connected to or that it's associated with is good or something like that. But it seems to me like a live option that it doesn't say that. And in fact, it doesn't say anything. It's just like a little boost, like a positive boost that has
Hmm.
a certain functional role in learning and in approach behavior. And then a negative valence has another role in learning and avoidance behavior.
Interesting.
Um, I think you could design a system that has a bunch of representations, but also has some tokens that it can use in computations that don't actually say anything about the world.
Hmm.
That seems to me
Interesting.
like conceivable.
Yeah. So the tokens that it's using in these computations would have some syntactic properties, making them suitable for use in computation, but not representational content, I guess is the idea.
Yeah.
Okay, interesting. Yeah. Okay. Cool. Because I was wondering if that reduced to the just the view of the phenomenological stuff going on, but it sounds like maybe not. I'm not sure if you get
I would
if.
want to I would want to say that some of that stuff can happen unconsciously. So I was going to say.
Okay. Good. All right. Interesting. Okay. So back to representation land for now. So, on your view, then there are going to be multiple different kinds, multiple formats used in perception, at least. I'm wondering if you think the same thing about cognition. Now, I know we haven't gone through all the details, and I do plan to get to that, but I just wonder generally if the kind of like, if you are only arguing for perceptual pluralism, or if you think that also in cognition you're going to have these multiple formats.
Definitely, I think in cognition you're going to have multiple formats and probably many more than you have in visual perception, for example. Just because, again, if you buy the logic that I started out with different computational demands for different information to be made explicit, that's going to pressure you to develop different representational formats. Then if you have a system like visual perception, which has a lot of different functions, you're going to need multiple formats there. And now if we're talking about central cognition, the number of functions that are being performed is like exponentially more. So you're going to need potentially many, many more formats.
Do we get a translation problem for each of these formats? Because I know you press the translation problem, especially against Ned, who we'll get to eventually. But he also thinks maybe you have the translation problem back in return. So I'm wondering if this maybe is a place where that might come up.
Yeah, I do think so. But I mean, I don't think of so when we talk about a translation problem, the problem sometimes people will in some corners of the philosophy of mind literature will talk about an interface problem, especially in philosophy of action. This is something that Butterfield and Sinigaglia had a classic paper about, and then there's a huge literature. People like Myrto Milopoulos, who you know, Josh Shepard, and a lot of other people have written about this. But there, the issue is about action and how somehow you have a propositional intention, like an intention to grab your phone or something, and then that issues in a motor command that's going to interface with the motor control system, which it's a reasonable assumption doesn't compute over propositional structures. It's got its own little weird formats. And so there's a question of how you get this fluid talking back and forth between two completely different formats of representation, and you could think of that as a really insurmountable computational problem. I tend not to think of it that way, especially these days. I think there are potential solutions to some of this. But yes, I do think that insofar as you're saying we've got a bunch of different formats, you have to have some way of thinking about how they interact.
Okay. So yeah, we'll get to this because I think that specifically the problem you think for Ned involves timing of this stuff. So we're going to come back to all that. But I'm just trying to set the stage, generally speaking, before we go into the details. So then if we have this view where there are many different kinds of formats, some in cognition, some in perception, mixing back and forth, is it your view that there are any proprietary formats, or do you reject altogether that there are any at all proprietary formats? Sorry.
So would a proprietary format mean that like it only ever occurs in this one system?
Yeah.
Or would it mean that there's a system that only ever uses one type of format?
Either either one would be interesting.
I think the first one, the claim that there are some formats that you only ever see in, for example, like low-level perception of like a luminance map.
Yeah.
Like a super early vision seems plausible to me, or like motor control. That motor control might just have, as I said, its own weird little formats that are different from the ones that are used by any other system and can't be directly accessed by any other system. That seems, I mean, obviously an empirical question, but it seems plausible that could exist. Whether there are any systems that are kind of marked off by their format in the way that Ned wants to claim perception is, that's really interesting. I'm skeptical just because every system that I know of that seems... Well, I guess the question here is how we individuate systems.
Right.
So if we're talking about coarse-grained things like the visual system or central cognition or like the auditory system, then I don't think there are any examples that are that general. But if we start talking about systems in the way that they're going to be individuated by, in practice in cognitive science, when people are like working on iconic memory, right? To take something that consciousness scientists have been really interested in. You could think of that as a system. It's a subsystem of vision, but it's definitely like a functionally identifiable system. I think in that case, it's pretty plausible that a super information-rich, iconic format is the only format that memory system has access to, and plays a role in identifying it as its own separate subsystem. So
Well, that'll make
Yeah, I
Ned
think,
happy. Yeah, he'll be very happy about that.
yeah. But yeah, so sorry for being a little long-winded on that, but I hadn't really thought of that question. But
Oh yeah,
um,
sorry. No, I don't. I'm not. Yeah, I'm not trying to take all your time. We got
yeah.
until you're bored of talking to me.
Okay.
Plenty of time. But okay, cool. So that I mean, these are interesting things to think about. I think so. It's cool to hear your thoughts on this stuff. So all right. So we have the picture where there can be all these different formats. Now you kind of get it from both sides in a way because part you have to argue that there's iconic format, that it's imagistic in some way. And then you also have to argue for this language of thought thing, both of which have, been notoriously subject to lots of controversy. So I wonder if we could just start with the iconic stuff. And if you could give us some brief indication of what you think maybe is the strongest or best evidence that there actually are mental images or icons in this sense.
Yeah, sure. I think one of the most famous areas of empirical evidence that has convinced people that there are icons in the mind, and I think is partly why you're right that there's pushback on both ends there, but I get it much more on the language of thought side than I do on the icon side.
Oh,
People are generally pretty okay to. Again, this just reveals my own little bubbles or whatever, but I have generally found people are happy to allow for images in the mind. But all the literature on mental imagery, so for example, the fact that if you ask people to identify a shape that, or whether or not two shapes match, that the amount of time that it takes them to accurately report that they do match increases linearly as a function of the difference in orientation,
right.
suggesting that there's some kind of mental rotation process there.
This is all
That's a
the
really
Coughlin
nice.
stuff, right? That's what you're referring to.
That one is Roger Shepard
Oh, Shepard.
and
Sorry, right.
Yeah, Shepard and Metzler. But yeah, there's a lot of Kotlin stuff too. I think in so something I've been working on recently is thinking about what the evidence for iconicity looks like in online vision.
Hmm.
So like mental imagery is kind of a special case because it might involve, seems like it does involve the use of visual iconic representations, but not in the context of visual perception, but just kind of just generating them from internally in some way. Um, and so I do think there's also evidence in online vision. I mentioned iconic memory, and I think there's also other evidence in the literature on ensemble perception, the way that we process entire sets of objects
Hmm.
without sort of parsing them into individuals, and just sort of operating on them as distributions of features laid out in space, and that just is seems to me is a good reason to think that there's some kind of imagistic representation of the distributions of features laid out in space. And the visual system does all this cool stuff with that, like deriving statistical summaries.
In what sense is iconic memory online vision?
Right. In the sense that you can't like activate iconic memory right now in the way that you can activate a mental image.
Oh,
So I
so
see
it's
what you mean.
stimulus
That
dependent.
yeah, but I mean, kind of not because it is a memory system. I see what you mean,
Yeah,
but yeah, it's not under your control. It's not activated unless there's a stimulus,
I
even though
see.
it's obviously not stimulus dependent for like once you have some information encoded in iconic memory, you can hold on to it for a few hundred milliseconds
Okay.
without any stimulus.
I see. And so is it also your view that just generally in perception when you're cruising around during the day that there's icons or mental images involved in just perceiving the red apple, not just iconic memory and these other things?
Yeah, but I think that as you mentioned, I also think that there are language of thought or discursive formats in vision. And I think that those are more likely to be in play when we're focusing on particular objects and processing them as an individual object that can be selected and tracked.
Hmm.
And so when we're doing things like in iconic memory, where you just get a bunch of information coming in, and then you hold on to it, and then that's able to be used and queued and so on. Um, or in ensemble perception, where you see 40 different lines at different orientations, and your visual system computes the average orientation of that entire set. That's where I think the icons are being deployed. So, like, if you
I
think
see.
about walking around in New York City, you might like focus on a particular person or a particular store or something like that. and I think you might be using some language of thought representations for that particular thing you're focusing on. But the way you're processing the scene in general is going to rely a lot on iconic representations.
Okay, very cool. And so I know you talk about in various places aphantasia or people who lack mental imagery, but I wonder if you could just bring that up here because I mean I happen to enjoy aphantasia at least for visual stuff. I can't do any mental imagery excepting auditory imagery and weirdly dreams, although that seems strange. But this doesn't. So I think what's nice about the way you formulate things is that you argue that this isn't really a challenge to the view. So I wonder if you could tell us why you don't think it's a challenge.
Why it's not a challenge to perception being iconic?
Yeah, or to like these iconic memories being iconic and things of that nature.
Yeah. The way that I think about aphantasia, although, I definitely don't have settled views on this, but the way that I think about it is it's a um, it's an inability to access imagistic representations for certain internal cognitive purposes. So your visual system, I think, the visual system of an aphantasic person is still constructing iconic representations all the time for the scene around them. And for a person that does not have aphantasia, they can construct some sort of, most people, it's not as vivid as regular perception, but some kind of compressed, lossy version of an image that would be constructed in normal visual perception. And in aphantasia, there's that bit of access and the ability to construct that compressed iconic representation seems to be impaired for some reason. And that to me does not suggest that the icons aren't available for regular visual perception.
Okay. So just side question then, when you're talking about iconicity and imagery generally, is there a commitment to this being conscious? So is it that on your view, aphantasic has a kind of phenomenological overflow, or is it rather like a kind of blind sight, or are those the wrong ways of thinking about it altogether?
Yeah. I I really just don't know what
Okay.
to say about that. I mean, I go back and forth on it. I think, the evidence on overflow has always seemed to me deeply equivocal because it's so hard to say whether or not the rich information that you can't report on is consciously experienced. Um, but I don't, in characterizing this stuff, I don't mean to be appealing to consciousness. So, like, I
Okay.
don't think you need to appeal to consciousness to say what it is that makes a mental representation iconic. It's not that you have some picture-like experience. It's that you have a data structure that's has a certain kind of organization.
Okay. Well, because there
And
is
so
like
that can be unconscious.
one of the lines of evidence sometimes people bring up is explicitly based on consciousness, though, namely the phenomenological similarity between imagery and perception. So that would be undermined in this case, or no?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, to me, the most convincing evidence would involve the functional similarity between imagery and perception. So the fact that, like, if you imagine a stimulus, then that plays the same role in messing with your regular visual experience. It plays the same role that weakly perceiving the same stimulus would. So there are experiments on this by Joel Pearson, for example, that, like, if you're doing binocular rivalry where you're seeing a Gabor patch tilted this way in one eye and this way in another eye, and you go back and forth between the conscious percept tracking one and then the other. If you imagine seeing one of them, then that primes you to see that one, which also happens when you weakly perceive it.
Right. So
So
that no, go
that seems to
ahead.
me like much strong. That seems to me like much stronger evidence than the phenomenal similarity.
I see. Okay, so this is more about the functional. Because when you say that, like you can't access the icon or image-like representation, then it does sort of seem like, well, at least there's a possibility that what's not accessed is phenomenological. What that exactly would mean, I don't know. I'm a skeptic about overflow, but I do sort of think of it as maybe something akin to common sense. It's just like not looking at the chair over there, but it's still there. So I do sort of feel the grip of that. But at the same time, it's nice to know that you're not committed to that for the view that you're saying to go forth.
Yeah, but I do think people have. I do think some people have that view, the view that you just laid out, that aphantasia does involve, like, phenomenal consciousness without access. When I was describing access, I sort of meant, which seems to me more plausible, that there's a failure to just construct the representation of the right sort. And there's a lot of controversy about that because some people, like Benson-Nane, would want to argue that no, the aphantasics are constructing mental images in a neurotypical way. They just don't have the conscious experience. So in his case, it's kind of the opposite. It's like access without phenomenal consciousness or something like that.
Right. Super blind
Um,
sight.
yeah, yeah. And that might be right, but it also might be that aphantasics aren't, or they're accessing maybe certain forms of imagery. Like Tomer Ullman, the psychologist at Harvard, has a view that kind of fits with his more general work on physics engine like behavior in folk physics. That like we have a physics engine just like a video game does, where there's the kind of base physics with the physical bodies bumping into each other, and then there's all the feature rendering. And so,
Cool.
like in a video game, like if you get shot at, what determines whether or not the bullet hits you is not anything about the visible features that you can see with all your like armor and stuff like that. It's just this hitbox, right? It's this much simpler thing, which makes sense computationally, that
Right.
you don't want to have to compute over the light ray on the visor of the helmet or something in order to figure out whether the bullet hit. So he has this view where that tracks human physical cognition, that we have a body physics and then a feature rendering system, and that aphantasia involves intact body physics, but the problem is in the generation of the feature rendering. And so
Interesting.
if that's right, yeah, it's a really interesting hypothesis. And if that's right, then that's not really um, that's very different than the view on which aphantasics have intact imagery with just depleted phenomenal consciousness. That would be a case where they're not getting the feature rendering at all. And so you could still get some of the hallmarks, the spatial hallmarks of imagery, like perhaps mental rotation, but without any of the kind of more fine-grained feature information. So
Interesting. So it could be because part of the reason why I'm asking is because, well, I like to talk about aphantasia, but also because if you're arguing that perception involves icons or images, then it seems like that's importantly a claim about minds generally, or our kind of mind. So if they really lacked imagistic representations, then that would be a challenge to the kind of view that you're defending, right? So it's important to,
definitely,
yeah, okay.
I mean, well, if they lacked them, period, in their minds, then yes. Like on my view, their visual perception would be enormously impaired, which is not.
Right.
So if but it could still be true that one on the kind of simple initial reading of aphantasia, some people you might think what it's showing is aphantasics just don't have any image, they don't have any mental images, period, not just consciously, not just at the level of
Right,
access or
exactly.
phenomenology or whatever, but none. And my view is compatible with that. I would, but so that's why I was saying that a way to think about aphantasia that's consistent with icons in online visual processing is that all of that stuff is unimpaired, and that there's this additional ability, which does seem quite different, of visual imagery, where in a way that's not triggered by your retina, but just that's triggered by your representation of some task or something like that in cognition, you generate this compressed version of the icons that are token in early visual processing. And that can be impaired without impairing the other thing. Those seem like very different mechanisms that we would expect to come apart.
Is this so? Would this be like an architectural response, that it's the process of the architecture as opposed to like the format that's different?
I think so. That's got to be right. I mean, if it turned out, I'm trying to imagine what it would look like if someone just didn't have any iconic representations in their online vision. On my view, you should get all kinds of impairments in not only iconic memory, but in statistical summary, in perception of space. That would be like a much more serious. That would be like a really that would be disabling. And aphantasia is like so far from disabling that we didn't even really have a clear idea of its existence until like 10 years ago.
Exactly. I only found out that I had it when I was in grad school, and we were talking about speckled hens, and I was like, wait, you guys are really picturing speckled hens? Like I thought that was a metaphor. So you're right; it was not impairing at all, and uh, anyway, so yeah, I think you're right about that. But it does sort of make me wonder about like blind sight, and especially cases like TN who display really sophisticated behavioral responses to the world. but presumably with no online icons or images, or are you just going to have to say
Mm,
that no, in that case there is? When Tian's walking down the hallway and avoiding all the obstacles, are you
yeah.
committed to there being some kind of iconistic representation?
I'm not sure.
Because you were just saying it had to be really impairing,
Yeah.
but he doesn't seem all that impaired, is what I'm thinking.
Well, he is pretty impaired. I mean, he's not fully blind, but blind sight patients don't have normal vision, and the problem is just in the consciousness, right? It's like you don't get perfect association like that.
Right.
But part of the reason I paused too, and again, great question that I had not thought of, but in a lot of blind sight patients, the damage is to V1, right? Like there's a lot of damage to V1.
Yes.
And V1, I would think, is an important locus of iconic representation in perception. It seems really important in iconic memory, for example.
Right.
Um, so it would be interesting if what's going on in blind sight is you have certain kinds of processing that are more like, that are less iconic, that are preserved. Um, but I'm not really sure. Uh, Yeah, this depends a lot on the neural details of exactly what's going on in blind sight.
Yeah.
And also on behavioral details, like behavioral experiments that, as far as I know, haven't been run and maybe would be difficult to run. Like, could you do a Sperling style partial report paradigm, an iconic memory experiment, on a blind sight patient?
Right.
That would be really interesting to see
I
if
know. I've
you.
been long time asking for that. I think that's exactly what the kind of thing that would be very cool to see. Exactly.
Yeah,
Okay. So, yeah, interesting. There's 100 rabbit holes that I'm trying to pass by at the current moment that are sucking me in, but pushing on past that to the more other side of this debate, because I ultimately want to get to your argument that, like you just mentioned, that object perception involves both a kind of discursive element as well as icon. But before we do the hybrid stuff, I want to go to the other side, the language of thought side, and talk about this paper that has been causing a big stir, the one that you wrote with Eric Mandelbaum and oh my gosh, I'm having a senior moment.
Nick Perot.
Yeah, Nick. Oh my God, dude. Okay, Nick Pro. Right. So this defending the idea that the language of thought hypothesis is important, and in places that you wouldn't have expected it. So it's not just central cognition where we're going to find these sorts of things. So you guys list a bunch of these criteria which you associate with this language of thought, and I wonder if you could give us a little, brief tour of these criteria, and then we'll talk about how they get applied.
Sure. So one preliminary thing, the reason why we did this in this paper in Behavioral and Brain Sciences, why we listed these properties was we kind of wanted to get away from thinking about what the essence of language is and then seeing whether it's realized in the mind. Like we were talking before, or kind of joking about Chomsky and the idea that the essence of language is a recursive merge operation.
Right.
I think that might be right. I mean, I don't know enough to be confident, but that could be right. But I wouldn't want to say that for there to be a language of thought architecture involved in animal navigation, for example, which seems to me like a live empirical hypothesis defended by people like Randy Gallistel, that for that to be true, we would need to show a recursive merge operation involved in that process. To me, that just doesn't seem right. So what we were thinking was the idea of a language of thought architecture is a more general idea that's not tied to the full expressive power of human language, which is like this incredible achievement of evolution that seems very unique. Whereas the language of thought hypothesis is supposed to apply, it was always supposed to apply, including for Fodor and Polysemy, to animal cognition
Right.
and to forms of cognition that are way older than language. So what do we say about that notion then? If it doesn't just mean take the essence of language and then find it in thought, for Fodor and Polysemy, there's not that much there actually that they said that gives you a good guide that would distinguish it from other kinds of structured representations like cognitive maps or even perhaps mental images. And this has been something there's a whole literature exploring this. People like my colleague Liz Camp and others like Michael Rescorla. And there's a paper by Ben Blumson arguing that cognitive maps are language of thought representations as Fodor and Polysemy understood them. And it seems to me like that might be true as an exegetical point, but like it doesn't really get at what we're talking about when we argue about the language of thought. And so our idea was let's list some properties that The only people who think all these properties cluster together in the mind are going to be language of thought people. And the people that don't like the language of thought are really going to not like the idea that these properties cluster together. Um, and so that was basically our method. And the properties are having discrete constituents. And so there the claim is that when you combine two representations into a larger structure, that you preserve the discreteness of the two representations. So they don't get kind of holistically intertwined in any way, which is not true in a lot of forms of representation that are easily neuroimageable, for example. There's lots of entanglement in the things that neuroscientists call representations.
So just before we go further,
Yeah,
can I just say these are none of these are meant to be like necessary or sufficient, right? Or are they?
they're not. We weren't trying to argue for the necessity or sufficiency. We were just trying to turn this into an empirical claim, and then that we get these properties clustering, and then look at the evidence. The discrete constituents one seems to me like clearly necessary. That if you were able, if you didn't have a system that could combine representations while maintaining the constituents of those representations as discrete entities, then you just would not have anything worth calling a language of thought.
So no slab.
Yeah,
Wittgenstein.
exactly.
Okay, Wittgenstein.
Or, yeah,
But just
or
really
like,
quickly on this same point though, so when I'm thinking about like imagistic representation on the computer screen, which I'm viewing your face on currently, I'm wondering about whether the individual pixels of which your image is composed count as discrete on this use or not.
yeah, the individual pixels might, but the individual pixels, or it's easier to think about like if we can think about little regions that are represent kind of more meaningful content, just easier to talk about than
Okay.
pixels.
Yeah.
I don't think it messes with your point at all. Uh, the thing is that those representations themselves are semantically complex. They're going to carry multiple forms of information. So, like if you just take any arbitrary region of the image on the screen in front of you, it's going to represent. It might represent part of my sweater, right? But that information that's at this region right here in the screen is going to carry information about a particular spatial portion of the scene in front of you. It's also going to carry hue information and saturation information and brightness information and potentially other information like size and all kinds of
Texture.
other stuff. Yeah, texture exactly. So all that information is represented explicitly, but without discrete constituents corresponding to each one. Right? So a picture in general is not a good example of discrete constituents. Even though if you want to talk about the constituents as the literal like portions of the image, it is true that they compose with each other apparently without kind of messing with each other. So you would get a level of discreteness there, but not kind of all the way down. At the level of the regions that are being composed, you're going to have all kinds of holistic, non-discrete composition going on.
Okay. So the important aspect of the discreteness is the representational discreteness in such a way that there's a one-to-one between the symbol and thing represented.
Yeah, I think that's right. If at least insofar as we're talking about information that's explicitly represented.
Right. Yeah, that's what I mean. Yeah.
So you might have, for example, and this is just I'm mentioning this in part because this is an objection that I've heard before that like, oh, you can if you have a concept like puppy that represents the property of being a dog, but it also represents the property of being young, and it doesn't have discrete constituents corresponding to those.
Right.
But of course, the puppy does not explicitly represent either of those properties, I would argue. So like if you had a system, if you had a token of puppy in some system, that system can compute over puppy, but it can't compute over young because that's not explicitly there. So what's interesting about images, and one of the things I think makes them kind of special, is they give you multiple explicit contents composed together without discrete constituents for each of those contents. But in the case of a language-like representational format, if you're going to have multiple properties represented explicitly, you need discrete constituents corresponding to each element of the content.
So just before moving on, why couldn't the system compute over young? Because it's not in the letters P U P P Y.
Or it's yeah, I mean, I guess it depends on what you think the semantic, how you think of like the lexical semantics.
Right.
Um, you might think that in the mind you parse puppy as just meaning young dog, and
Uh-huh.
so in the mind the concept puppy really is complex and does have young as a constituent.
Right.
But then in that case, it's not true that it doesn't have discrete constituents corresponding to young and to dog. It does. It's just they're only taken in the mind. So I was that was kind of like a very in the weeds dialectical move that I just like wheeled out there without much without giving context. So I'm sorry
But
about that,
still,
but
even so though, someone could have the view that maybe it's like a fused thing, young puppy, as not discrete elements, but somehow young dog is the semantic meaning to the symbol puppy, but they're not discrete. It's somehow fused in some way. So that would be a way of trying to thread this
yeah,
needle.
yeah. If you had an argument for that,
Right, I
then
don't.
for sure, yeah, yeah. But I guess I was just thinking I just wanted to really make clear the difference between saying you're representing some property that is complex. You can do that without representing each part of that property. But if you're going to represent that property and all of the complexity with each portion being represented, a language-like representational format is going to represent each piece of that property, like youth and dogness, with different representational vehicles.
Okay.
And a picture doesn't do that.
Right. So that's what the notion of discreteness is. Okay, good. And the next is
Um, so I'll just list the properties really quickly. Discrete constituents, role filler independence, predicate argument structure, logical operators, inferential promiscuity, and abstract conceptual content. So we just did discrete constituents. Role filler independence is related but dissociable to discrete constituents. And the idea of role filler independence is you have syntactic roles. So, like if you say, I was just reading Nick Shea's book and he talks about this example a lot. Dog bites man is different from man bites dog. And so in that case, you have the role of agent and patient. Those are two different roles in the system. Those roles are going to be the same whether it's dog bites man or man bites dog, even though the thing that fills them is different. So the way in which the system encodes the syntactic role is independent from the particular value that fills it. And that goes in both ways, so such that it's the same representation man that's tokened in man bites dog and in dog bites man. The fact that those are very different situations with very different significance and very different ways that you might visualize them and so on. If those propositions are represented with a language of thought format, none of that is going to be reflected in the representation of man being itself different. The representation of man is exactly the same in dog bites man and man bites dog. It's just occupying a different role. So you have independence between the roles and the representations that fill them.
so could you have that without discrete elements?
I think you could, in principle, it might like not be practical or something, but you could have a system that uh, did something like matrix multiplication, which is a way that you get like an approximation of compositionality in some neural network architectures, where somehow the contribution of dog or man to that matrix is exactly the same when it's in the agent position as when it's in the patient position. And yet you don't have discrete constituents because you're just getting a tensor product.
A vector, right? Okay.
Yeah.
It's interesting. So is role filler independence a way of avoiding saying compositionality so as not to trigger people, or is there some significant difference between that and compositionality?
Yeah, I think you could get compositionality without role filler independence, actually. So I think role filler independence is more demanding than mere compositionality in some respects. And although maybe in the example I just gave, it's kind of less demanding because the matrix multiplication wouldn't, by some people's lights, be full-blown compositionality.
Right. I
But
wouldn't
you
say
could
that.
have, yeah, but you could have compositionality without role filler independence, I think. So you could have, and again, depending on how you understand compositionality, but um, you could have a view in which you take the concept green and you compose it into green pen and green apple. and the contribution, and this example I think is borrowed from Charles Travis, but the way in which green contributes to that those phrases is different, you might think.
Hmm.
So like in green apple, it requires that the thing be visibly green, and in green pen it doesn't,
Right.
right? It just requires that the ink inside be green. Um, Now one view you could have is, so what? That those are just different ways of being green. That doesn't really entail a difference in what green is contributing. That's what Fodor would have said. That's fine. But you could have a different view in which they are no, that does reflect a difference in what's being contributed. So you don't have role filler independence. But you do still have this representation green that's getting, there's a compositional operation where you combine it with pen, you get something, you combine it with
So that's the
apple,
sense
you
in
get
which
something.
but if I'm understanding what you're saying, then in compositionality, it's not just that the parts can interchange, but the meaning stays the same. Whereas what you're saying is you could have a system where the parts interchange, but the meaning isn't the same.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, interesting, right? And I do think this sounds plausible, like especially not for green maybe, but for words like keep, like he kept his promise, or you say keep on keeping on. Like, are they the same? Like, I don't know. So I kept the napkin, I kept my promise. In what sense is like being kept the same in those cases?
Yeah, although what Fodor would say is that's the difference between promises and napkins.
Yeah, it's true. We do miss the Fodor quips, don't we? I have to say, in philosophy, we don't have another voice like Fodor's yet.
Yeah.
Auntie and Grandma are missed. Okay, so very interesting. So that's two of them, and then the third one.
The third one is predicate argument structure, and that's kind of like what I hope would be the sort of basic thing that you would think about when you think about the language of thought, which is you've got a little primitive sentence being represented where you have a predicate like green, and you've got a representation of an argument like just a representation of an individual, or it could be demonstrative or something. And then you apply that predicate to the argument and you bind them together into a structure that is accurate if and only if the thing has the property that's represented by the predicate.
So is this like disquotational, some kind of disquotational property where the meaning is just like what the thing says, disquoted?
It's a little more than that, I think.
Okay.
The idea is that not just that you have a representation that says that something is green, which you could do in a lot of different formats. Like you could do this in with smoke signals, right? Or like with like Paul Revere, right? The British are coming by land, the British are coming by sea.
Right.
And there's lots of rich predicate argument structure there, but not in the vehicle,
Okay.
right? So in the vehicle, it's just one light or two lights or what. I don't even remember
One
what.
if by land, two if by sea. Come on, man.
I don't
You're
remember what
from
it's
Boston
one.
area and you don't know this?
I am. What was it? One? Was it a lighthouse? Was it?
A flag, I think, or something. I don't know. Or was it a
Okay, you don't
lantern?
know
Or maybe it
either.
was a lantern. Yeah, I actually don't know
Yeah.
either. I'm from California.
I know. I
I'm
should
not supposed to
remember
know.
this. This is embarrassing. But in a case like that, you have predication at the like in the content, but you don't have it recapitulated in the structure of the vehicle.
Right. Okay. I see.
The vehicle just is one, whatever, or two. Um, if you have a predicate argument structure, then you have a vehicle that corresponds to the predicate, that corresponds to the property, a vehicle that corresponds to something, and then a syntactic relation between them that makes it the case that this whole structure that's made out of these two things in the syntactic relation expresses the content that the thing has the property.
I see. Okay. So these first three, do they rule out holism about content or vehicles, or because I'm sort of starting to get the feeling that maybe they do, but I don't know if that's the intention here or not.
It's definitely not the intention. Um, the only one that I could
Oh,
imagine.
oh, sorry. Go ahead. I'll say what I was going to say after.
Okay, and this is quick. The only one that I could see potentially having a problem for semantic holism would be role filler independence. But what were you going to say?
Well, yeah, I was going to say I was thinking specifically of someone who has a view maybe like David Rosenthal's, where it's all like you get compositionality after the fact, but first you get like sentence-sized things, and then yeah, you can end up with concepts, but you have to do some analysis, you have to do some regimentation, you got to do some work actually before you can extract out things which you can see as moving around carrying the same meaning. But that's still, I would want to say, if you had a view, which I don't have a view like that, but if you did, couldn't you have a language of thought like view on that kind of picture? But it's sort of sounding like the way we're defining what a language of thought is going to push against that, because it sounds like it has to be more than after the fact. It's got to be built into the like ground level on this way of thinking.
That's definitely true. However, semantic holism itself, I think, is less radical than the view that you just articulated.
Yeah.
Although I agree with you that David Rosenthal has said things like that. Um, I think semantic holism would just say that anytime you get a change in the functional significance, however that's articulated, inferential role or something like that, um, that for some concept, some primitive representation that changes its semantic significance. And I think that is compatible actually with those three properties, because you could have a discrete constituent that means green, just to stick with that example, that gets composed in a discrete way that obeys role filler independence and can be figure and predicate argument structures. Um, and then every time its functional significance changes, that changes the semantic value of that thing. That I think is strictly compatible.
But this more radical version of holism is not compatible.
I mean, the more radical version just seems to me like a denial of the language of thought hypothesis, right? That like somehow what's really going on causally is not accessing any there's no language of thought structure there, and you're just doing some kind of it's an artifact of how we understand what's going on post hoc, or rather, it's like a instrumentalism about the language of thought.
Interesting. Yeah, I guess I would want to. Yeah, that's an interesting discussion there, because I would want to see it as kind of, well, I mean, this wouldn't be David's view, but my interpretation of a view like that would be that maybe there are like just like sentence-sized things that have meanings and by relations to other sentence-sized things. But if they're sentence-sized, then there's got to be some sense in which they're language-like, even if they don't have parts at their constitutive level. Yeah, but anyway, maybe that's a separate debate, because this is probably not a very popular view anyway, so maybe you don't need to worry too much about it. But so really, would you not count that view as language-like, even if you started with like a Seller's version of this, where it's like you get.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, so what I interpret sentence sized as meaning for people like Sellers and Rosenthal is that the mental state has a truth or valuable content,
Right.
even though it doesn't have any sentential structure. So
Right.
it doesn't have any internal structure at all. And so in that sense, it's not a sentence in a language of thought. It's just more like an atomic proposition, like in kind of undergrad logic,
Yeah.
right? Now, one thing that I have wondered about, and this leads to some of the other properties. So one of the other properties is having an explicit logical operator, like a little symbol that means if or and or not. Um, and one thing I've wondered about is you could, in principle, seems to me, have a mind that has predicate argument structure and the other properties of a language of thought, but no logical operators. And in fact, maybe some animals are like this, I would argue. You could also have a mind that has atomic propositions in this kind of sense. So no internal structure, no predicate argument structure, but has logical operators and can connect the atomic propositions like A or B, or P or Q, depending on your way of thinking about it. Uh, and what's interesting to me is those seem kind of equally simple. Like if you're thinking about what's the simplest language of thought that we might observe in the animal kingdom, the atomic propositions plus logical operators seems to me like a priori equally as simple as predicate argument structure with no logical operators, because they each have some kind of apparatus that the other doesn't have. But where I think there's actually quite a bit of evidence for the predicate argument structure with no logic, I'm not aware of any evidence for the atomic propositions with logic anywhere in the animal kingdom. So that's kind of interesting that evolution has worked out that way. I don't really
Yeah.
have a reason why that needs to have happened.
Interesting. Okay. All right. So we've already mentioned logical operators, so maybe we don't need to dwell on that too much. But so that's what leaves us with the last two.
Yeah, and the last two are inferential promiscuity, which means if you have a language of thought format, it should be useful for reasoning of various kinds. And then the final one is abstract conceptual content, which means, I mean, and again, none of the, this one is probably not necessary, um, but it is a good, I think, useful hallmark or signature property that if you have a language of thought format, there's no reason why the primitive meaningful representations should be highly restricted in what they can represent. So compare this to if you have, for example, an analog format where you've got some kind of continuously varying magnitude that corresponds to some continuously varying magnitude out there in the world, like height on a mercury thermometer corresponding to temperature
Right.
out there in the environment. Um, if you're representing things in it with an analog magnitude, that's going to restrict. That's going to place like highly non-trivial restrictions on what kinds of things you can represent. And in particular, it's going to make it especially useful for representing various low-level perceptible properties, which do vary in this magnitude-like way. It's not going to be useful for representing some category in an abstract way, like the category bottle. Right? You could, that's not to deny that you could devise an analog system that could encode information like bottle, but insofar as you have a representational system that's really good at getting abstract categorical properties and encoding them in a way that doesn't say what the particular visual features of the bottle are, that's good evidence that you've got a symbol that just means bottle and doesn't say anything else.
Yeah.
And that looks more like a word, like a primitive unit in a language of thought.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So we got these 6 criteria. Now, your guys' argument is that you find at least some of these 6 in many different places. So how many of them, I wonder, would you need for you to say there is a language of thought there? If you just had one, like, for example, when you argue that object perception is discursive, which of these properties is discursive invoking?
Yeah. So I think in the case of visual perception that we discussed, which include the way in which you represent an individual object in vision as something you can track and attribute properties to, but also the way in which you represent the part-whole structure of inside that object, and then structural relations between multiple different objects, like my representation of your printer as being on the desk in the background. Um, we argue that those exhibit all of the properties except for logical operators. We don't really have good evidence for that. It also hasn't been investigated that much as an explicit sort of question. So it's more of a question mark than a X next to that property. But I
But
think
5 out
you
of 6 is
find,
enough to say there's language of thought.
yeah, well, I mean, this can be fuzzy. Like our the notion that we're working with is the idea that language of thought is a natural kind, and we're understanding kinds to be clusters of properties.
Okay.
So then this is borrowed from the philosophy of science literature based on Richard Boyd.
Right.
And his idea was that we don't need necessary properties or sufficient properties. What we need are clusters of properties that cluster together homeostatically. And where that means that if you have some of the properties, then you're likely to have others of the properties. So if you have 1 or 2 properties, that just saliently raises the probability that you have some of the others.
I see.
So
Okay.
what you need is just to get a kind of rewarding inductive inference. And that doesn't need to be perfect. So it could turn out that none of these cases have all of the properties. It could also turn out, and this is an empirical question, that there are like subclusters that cluster together. And so maybe like the 6 properties together are not a natural kind, but maybe like some subcluster is one natural kind and another is another natural kind.
Yeah.
And our goal was not so much to say, here is the recipe for identifying whether something counts as a language of thought. Our goal was to say, we do see a bunch of these properties all over the place. And so we should have this is an empirically respectable working hypothesis. And what we should do now is try to figure out what the real underlying natural kinds are, what the distributions of these properties are like. So one way in which I think this is, you can see why this is an inductively rewarding hypothesis is to take object perception, for example. The evidence for discrete constituents is very different from the evidence for abstract conceptual content, and it's very different from the evidence for role filler independence. And yet they all cluster together in this one kind of representation in visual cognition. Now, if we're right that we're tapping into a kind here, that's not surprising.
Right.
But it kind of is just a coincidence if you think, no, there's no kind here. This is just a mess of properties. Then, like, why is it that the very same representations that the visual system uses to track objects show evidence for discrete constituents in terms of features being lost separately from each other rather than as a package? Why is it that those very same representations also seem to encode abstract categorical content? Is that just a coincidence? I guess so, but the more those coincidences pile up, the more pressure I think that places on a skeptical interpretation.
Yeah, interesting. But I do sort of wonder, like, if like a natural response would be sort of Ned's view that what you have is this cognitive envelope. I was going to bring that up later, but maybe this is a good place to bring it up because on Ned's view, you have this strict border between perception and cognition, but yet they interact in such a way that he says you can take a strictly iconic imagistic representation and enclose it in a cognitive envelope. I'm not exactly 100% sure what that means, unless it just means it's broadcast in a global workspace, which I think is what it means. But if you do have that, then you're going to get these properties kind of clustering due to the cognitive part, which sort of naturally aligns with those. So I know you have an objection to that, which I want to ask you about in a second. But first, before the objection, is that a way that you could try to explain the coincidence on your view?
I think no.
Okay.
So I think that it's kind of an orthogonal question about whether or not this object file construct that we're talking about is in vision or whether it's in like visual cognition, like at the interface. For the purpose of just like that behavioral brain sciences paper defending the language of thought, we're not like not much hangs on the claim that it's in the visual system proper as opposed to visual cognition. The point is that nobody, including Ned, thinks that what you're doing with those object file representations is like relying on your natural spoken language, like English. So the interesting idea is that those representations that are usable in visual cognition have a discursive format as we've characterized it. And so if it turns out that they're in vision, cool. If it turns out they're not, that's equally fine. Like it would only be a concern for our claim if it turned out that it was somehow really just down to inner speech or something like that. Like it was really just your spoken language rather than a language of thought. But I think Ned wants to agree that the studies that we cite are evidence for language of thought, and he just wants to say this doesn't show language of thought in the visual system. Right. It shows language of thought in visual cognition, like in visual working memory at the interface between vision and cognition, equally of interest to someone who wants to defend the language of thought. But then there's this other dispute that I've had with Ned and that Eric has also had elsewhere with Ned, where we want to argue that there are language of thought structures in vision proper, and therefore that the border between vision and cognition can't be just that vision is always iconic.
Okay.
And so there's two different dialectics there.
Yeah. So I guess the one about which system is it in will become important if that's the way he wants to like segregate them. But I guess I was thinking if just more generally that your charge was that, gee, guys, isn't it a coincidence that you get these kind of properties clustering together? And I wasn't really thinking about it just being in the visual system, but just in this phenomenon of object tracking or object, which might involve working memory. It depends on how you define it and all those things. But anyway, so if there's some cognitive aspect to that, then those guys can say, yeah, the stuff you're talking about, this language of thought stuff is related to that cognitive thing, not to the visual thing, thereby changing the topic to which system is it in, I guess. But it's still a way to try to account for the fact that these things cluster together. That was my main question.
Right, but it wouldn't be a way of explaining why they cluster together that's opposed to the language of thought hypothesis. It would be a way of explaining why they cluster together that's like that's agreeing with the language of thought interpretation of those findings, but saying they don't shed light on vision, they just shed light on this aspect of cognition.
I see. So
our opponent in the language of thought paper is someone who doesn't think the language of thought exists anywhere.
Right, I get
including in cognition.
Yeah. Right. So okay, right. So then if you don't have any language of thought hypothesis, then what explains that these cluster together?
Exactly.
Right. Okay, I see. I misunderstood. Okay. Now I want to ask about these logical operators before we go to the other more secure ones. I know you guys say you don't have a lot of evidence for them, but I wonder what you make of the alleged evidence against them. So Ned has made a big deal that perception doesn't evince these kinds of logical operators, that you can't see red or green, or you can't see if red then green, things of that nature. You don't perceive them, I mean. And also there's the work from the empirical side, which suggests that, infants don't have negation and so forth at a certain age. So I just wonder what you make of, so if there's not a lot of evidence for logical operators, what do you make of the evidence against it? Do you think it can be refuted or responded to?
Yeah. No, I mean, I think in general that critique is well founded. In the paper, we do argue for logical operators in infants and animals. That's the part of the paper that I think, speaking for all three of us, that we're the least confident about, and that there's been the most kind of recent work on, and there are alternative explanations of the data. I think of it more as just an open question at the moment.
Okay.
I don't think that we know that infants don't have logical operators, and you need to there's some data points that need to be explained where infants seem to be able to do some versions of the disjunctive syllogism task. And then the question is, are they using something other than the disjunctive syllogism to accomplish that task?
Right.
And we argue that, well, they have some of the same behavioral signatures that adults do when they do the very same task, including things that happen in their pupils, and the directions of their eyes and so on, these kind of oculomotor signatures, but are those really signatures of disjunctive syllogism rather than something else? It's very in the weeds.
Right.
But that said, I'm happy to grant for the sake of argument that we don't have logical operators in vision proper. And I don't really know what to infer from that, because you have whenever you have limitations in what a system can represent, that limitation can arise because the system represents in a format that doesn't allow for those contents to be explicitly represented. Or it could be that it's not, the constraint is not due to the format, but it's due to the other computational demands of the system. So like it could be true that the visual system can't represent very, very general color properties, like warm and cool. Suppose it were true that it couldn't.
Okay.
What exactly would that tell us about the visual processing? I'm not really sure. I mean, it could be that it's just that's not a useful way to encode color. The visual system prefers to, it's more useful for the particular computations that the visual system has to perform to represent more specific color information. And that's not really arising due to some aspect of the format. It's not like the format makes that impossible. We know, or at least there's some reason to think, that the visual system doesn't have to represent maximally specific color properties. It can like abstract over the range of properties. So maybe the format itself would allow for it to encode warm and cool, but the visual system just never bothers doing that.
Right.
And so likewise, I think we have a question of like, is it this system evolved to carry out some particular functions? Do those functions require having access to logical operators? Maybe no. And then we have an explanation for why there's no logical operators that is not due to the representational format. I don't think you can just, I think people sometimes can over attribute aspects of how a system works to the format of that system, but there are a lot of other factors there. There's a new paper that I was just looking at by E.J. Green on the laws of appearance, like the fact that you can't represent something as red and green simultaneously. And he thinks like format can explain some of these things, but to really get a full picture of why these generalizations hold, you need to understand other aspects of the computational demands that are imposed on, on the visual system.
I think that's a good point. I think people do tend to sort of get roped into this idea that's got to account for everything, but there's a lot of other things we can appeal to. Yes, good point. So
Richard, do you mind if we take like a 2-minute break?
Not at all.
Cool. I just have to go to the bathroom.
Yeah, do so.
Okay, I'll be right back.
The pleasures of live broadcasting. I'll be monologuing while you're gone, refuting everything you said. All right, guys, we're going to take a 2-minute break. So if you have any questions, I see some questions in the chat out there, but feel free to ask them. And then at the end, before I let Jay go, we're going to try and spend some time answering those. So let's go ahead. I will take this break as well. Oh yeah. I came straight from the skate park to here, so I'm a little bit discombobulated, but I'm glad to be here. That's a good question, Pooja, that I see you asking there about where the screen is. So I'm going to ask Jake that at the end. As I said it earlier, if you have questions, be sure to drop them for us to get to.
And we're back.
We're back. No commercial breaks here, just blank screens. Very cool. By the way, Jake, if you got to go or you got better things to do with your time, you just let me know. We could be done. I sort of got to be done around 3 anyway because the kids get home from school, so that's roughly my plan. But
That's cool.
okay, I did want to ask about this logical operator stuff. I really like that point that you made that maybe there are other factors that explain it in visual processing. Maybe it can do it, just doesn't need to or want to, or it's not practical. But where do you think maybe the most suggestive evidence is? I was thinking motor cortex and those kinds of things. Maybe those would be important. But where in your I don't remember exactly what you guys say in your paper, so can you help us remember? Like, what do you think is the most suggestive piece of evidence or place to look for these kinds of things?
For language of thought, or for
no,
things?
logical operators specifically.
I see. Yeah. I don't really know in terms of like thinking about where in the mind. So some of the evidence that we cite that is, in my opinion, the most compelling for logical operators being used outside of online natural language processing is in automatic cognition or implicit or system one cognition.
Hmm.
So a lot of the stimuli here are linguistic stimuli, but the way that some of these paradigms work, so some of them involve implicit bias and ways of modulating implicit bias through presenting logical counter evidence. But another kind of even more direct piece of evidence, in my opinion, is that if you give people arguments that are logically valid and have a conclusion that is not believable. So if it's something like, if the sky is blue, then penguins can fly. The sky is blue, and then the conclusion. And now in the like 80s, it was discovered that if you did that very argument that I just gave you and asked people to evaluate it for validity, for like, give them some prompts on what validity is, and then ask like, is
Yeah,
this
they say invalid.
they'll say invalid, or they'll be slowed down, and they'll make more errors. They still are good at it, but you get some errors.
Yeah.
And so this was taken as part of the torrent of evidence from that era, in favor of a dumb, quick system one. And so the claim was, in order to get the correct logical answer, you've got to engage the slower, more deliberative mode of processing that you might think relies on things like inner speech. So once you can exploit the logical structure of English or whatever your spoken language is in working memory in a slow and deliberate and conscious way, then you can arrive at the correct logical answer. But we cite evidence which is now quite overwhelming in the past 10 to 15 years, showing that you get the exact same interference in the other direction. So if you're asked to evaluate whether or not it's believable that penguins fly, you are slowed down if it's presented as the conclusion of a logically valid argument.
Interesting.
And that is impossible to explain if the explanation for the original finding was correct. because that means that you get this quick, unconscious system one process that's deriving the logical validity.
Right.
And so there's just tons of different paradigms exploring this, and the evidence now, in my opinion, is completely decisive that we have that system one automatic implicit processing has access to logical operators and can run things like modus ponens in a way that's automatic. And part of the reason automaticity is important is because it rules out alternative explanations that involve things like inner speech. But another reason it's important is because if you have a language of thought architecture with logical operators, then you can have rules that are built into the system that just take representations with one kind of logical structure and transform them into representations of another kind of structure.
Mm-hmm.
And if that's what's going on, and that's a way that a lot of classical theorists like Fodor and Polysemy have thought about certain forms of logical inference. If that's what's going on, then that should happen automatically. Because that rule is not going to consult whether or not that's what you want to do given the task that you're involved in. That rule is just going to operate. And so the fact that the evidence once looked like logic was not the kind of thing that could be processed automatically, I think it's not a coincidence that sort of stuff rose to prominence in cognitive science around the same time that people started to move away from the language of thought idea. And so we think it's a nice piece of evidence for logical operators in exactly this, playing exactly the kind of role that the language of thought hypothesis should predict.
I mean, it is a bit interesting that it's a valid argument form as opposed to an invalid one. It doesn't seem as though, or maybe there is some kind of constraint, which would suggest that you would have the valid ones built into the system, especially given certain the functional advantage to certain forms of irrational thought. Like if you think something's closer, you're more likely to get to it, reach for it, etc. So, which some people have used to try to explain motivation, and so forth. So, I wonder, like, does the view predict that you would find evidence for, like, all sorts of different argument forms, some of which are valid, some of which are not, or what would privilege the modus ponens on your view, or does that not matter to you? Maybe it's one of those boring questions.
No, I think it's a super interesting question. It's one that I've wondered about quite a bit.
Oh, okay.
So one thing that I think is definitely not going to be true is that the logic of thought, if the way that I've just described things is correct, that like there really is a logic of thought with some operators and some built-in rules. Mm-hmm. One thing that's definitely not going to be true is that it's first order classical logic.
Yeah, bummer.
Because that gets all kinds of things that are weird, right? And then I think it's an empirical question whether there are lots of mistakes that people make, and we both, I'm sure, are taught logic. You see this in just regular, intelligent, educated undergrads,
right?
And so one question is what explains that, and is it explained by this kind of a mental logic, or is there some other factor explaining it? And so one kind of argument form that you see all the time is affirming the consequent.
Yes.
Right. So if P then Q, people infer P from that. Is that tapping into the same kind of automatic logical process that's really telling you about the structure of thought? Or is it tapping into something else? Is it tapping into some kind of a causal reasoning? Is something going on outside of the basic logical compositional form? And I think the evidence on that is not as clear. Mm-hmm. So there's some evidence for automaticity of affirming the consequent, and there's some evidence against it.
Right. Interesting. Because affirming the consequent is like suspiciously similar to argument to the best explanation. So that's where it could be like some other kind of factor that's causing that.
Exactly. That's what I'm inclined to think. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I mean, I agree with you, of course, that there are all kinds of irrational thought patterns that we engage in, but that seems to me like maybe a different phenomenon than the kind of basic compositional structure of thought. I mean, that might be more relying on this kind of like exactly what you're just gesturing at, this kind of like larger process of making sense of the world in a way that's like protective of my ego and things like that. That's not necessarily telling you about the basic logical rules. And kind of part of the reason that we need to engage in some of that irrational ego protective or other kind of cognition is arguably because we're very good at picking up on the logical consequences of things. especially in a straightforward modus ponency kind of way, so that when we, if you do something kind of jerky to someone, um, there's a threat of you like not liking yourself anymore as a result of that,
Right.
and then that comes with all kinds of maladaptive consequences.
Right.
And so something that I've argued in some work and that Eric Mandelbaum has argued at length, and I've been very influenced by him on this, is the idea of a psychological immune system.
Right.
That term is, I think, borrowed from Dan Gilbert, but that you've got this base, at least the way that I think about it is you've got this baseline, very smart, very logical form of thinking, and then you've got this additional on top of that kind of way of making sense of the world in a not perfectly logical way that's trying to balance things like, am I going to be able to live with myself if I adopt this view of the world rather
Is
than
is
another
this
one?
in your paper, How Not to Think About Death? Is that part of it?
Yes, that
Yeah.
is part of that
Very cool
paper, the
paper.
immune system idea.
Yeah. So is this going to correspond to system one and system two? This making sense being system two and the logical part system one?
That's kind of how I think of it, although it's sort of weird. It's ironic in a way because people would be very happy to attribute to themselves the logical stuff and not happy to attribute to themselves the irrational,
Exactly.
self-serving rationalization stuff. So that's one of the many reasons that might push you into thinking that the system one, system two terminology is not really carving the mind at its joints. But it does seem to me that the smarter stuff is in general going to be more automatic, and the more, I mean, also smart in a way, but not as truth seeking
Right.
kinds of rationalization are going to be less automatic and more resource demanding,
Interesting.
which is kind of an inversion of the classic way of thinking about it.
Yeah, exactly. Because usually you would have these like unconscious associations are kind of dumb, but the smartness is the slow, like
Yeah.
reasoning process. That's an interesting one of those strange inversions that Dennett loves to talk about. On this notion, I wonder, on your view, then I know this is kind of tangential, but I just occurred to me. I wonder, can we alter that implicit stuff, or is it like hardwired into the system, or is it something like because like you just mentioned, I've taught logic for 17 years now, and I think that the way I think about arguments has changed. I certainly understand only if a lot better than I used to. But so is that a process of like these things becoming automatic on your view, or is this system sort of encapsulated in a way that you can't alter?
Great question, open question, I think, to a large extent. I'm very, very like, I have a very kind of undecided attitude towards questions of innateness in general, so I
Mm,
don't really want to make a strong claim. That's one thing that, we were kind of hoping with our paper to do is like point out that you can think really hard about the language of thought hypothesis and what the evidence for it looks like without really getting into the nativist empiricist debate at all,
yeah.
which is a debate that, and I think of it as totally dissociable. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, the language of thought could be entirely induced in a neural network or something,
Hmm.
on the basis of data. That's like I don't have a strong view about that. And so, likewise, when it comes to these kinds of logical rules that seem to be built in, are they built in because they're there innately, or are they learned? And if so, can you change them? One thing that we discuss in the paper is that, generally speaking, association and conditioning seem to be pretty bad ways of changing your implicit cognition.
Hmm.
So it's not just going to be kind of simple repeated exposure to like the extinction of the association or something like that. That doesn't seem to be a very useful. But that's not to deny that there are other ways that you can acquire procedures in thought that you didn't have before, which seems undeniable and pervasive. And so could some of those procedures that you acquire involve logical types of transitions? I don't know of that much work on this. I do know that the way that a lot of the dual systems people that have been looking at this more recent evidence for logic in thought, like Wim Deneys, for example, who had a BBS paper in the past few years on this, he thinks of all of it as originating in system two and then like kind of getting pushed downward into system one, and that's how you learn to be good at logic. I kind of don't buy that for things like modus ponens.
Hmm.
That like really people like learn to be good at modus ponens, and that's why people that have never taken a logic class are at ceiling on like rapidly and automatically processing modus ponens. That doesn't seem quite right to me. Just because I don't know what the learning procedure would have been like there.
Hmm.
Um, but yeah, I think it's all an open empirical question.
Interesting. So now this is totally out of left field, but it just occurred to me. I wonder, and feel free to pass on this, but I wonder what like this kind of view is going to say to someone like a Kripke who argues that there's something special about logic, that it can't, that there's, we can't have empirical reason like change our logic or adopt a logic. So classical logic it is. We can't just decide one day to start thinking in terms of non-classical logic. We can use non-classical logic, but there's a kind of prior sense in which reason itself works in a certain way that you can't alter. That's somehow special. That's not what I mean. So yeah, I just wonder what the view
Yeah.
you're saying right now might say about that.
I mean, I take it that his view is not really a psychological claim that that like repeated exposure couldn't change the fundamental rules of thought, but rather that you couldn't do that process in a way that's rational. You couldn't
Right.
like rationally have reason to change your logic.
Right.
And I don't have a view on that
Okay.
that issue about the rationality, but I do think it's a super interesting question whether or not just the kind of more functional empirical question of can you come to adopt a different language than the one that you have, whether that is rational adoption or not.
Right.
And I mean, one thing where I think one empirical claim where I think I probably do agree with Kripke is that when a logician is working with some weird logic that's not intuitive, and they come to find it more intuitive over time, that's probably not because now the rules of that logic are fundamental rules of cognition in the same way that things like modus ponens are,
Hmm.
but rather that's all probably like at a higher level of psychological processing where they're just kind of converting all of those rules into more intuitive rules at a lower level.
Hmm.
Um, like so you could like one way that you could do that is if you have some weird rule of logic, you could say, okay, if I have an instance of that rule, then I do this. Here's an instance of that rule, therefore I'll do this.
Right.
That's modus ponens, right?
Right.
And you can put in weird rules that way. And so if that's what's going on, then the kind of psychological bedrock would be modus ponens.
Right.
And yet you're kind of virtually adopting a different logic. And so I assume that that's what Kripke would want to say is going on in a lot of these cases, and that is how I would think of them, how I tend to think of them as well.
Interesting. Okay, good. So now we've been having this very cool discussion about these things, and I want to focus now on object perception, if we could, and go through the evidence that you said all of these, maybe with the exception of logical operators, are present there. So discrete units, I forget the word now that you used, but
Constituents.
yes, this discrete constituents is going to entail that you should be able to separate out aspects. Is that going to be how the evidence is going to proceed for that?
Yeah. So, for example, there are lots of cases where you might encode the color of something without encoding the shape, or
Hmm.
vice versa. But and that's itself is perhaps not very instructive about the format of the representation. But suppose you have encoded both the color and the shape. Now, how those things can be lost independently of each other does implicate the format of the representation. Sorry, my cat is
Hey,
trying
join
to
join the convo.
snuggle my laptop. Um, and so, in the case of object representations in visual working memory, once things like color and orientation are encoded into the object representation, they can be lost independently of each other. And so this is like a really clear empirical test of discrete versus holistic compositionality.
Hmm.
If you had an image-like representation that holistically combines features, I would predict that this would be true of something like iconic memory, where there are more there's more plausibly iconic formats. Although this question, I don't believe, has been tested there. But on trials where you have lost the orientation of some colored object, uh, if you have holistically combined representations, then those should also tend to be the trials in which you lose the color information, and
Right.
vice versa.
Hmm.
Whereas if you have discrete constituents that are getting combined into that object representation, you could easily lose one without the other. And in the case of focally attentive object perception, of the kind that you can store in visual working memory, it turns out that the evidence all looks like discrete constituents.
Right. So are you thinking of the conjunction errors from like Treisman or some other kind of evidence here?
I'm thinking no. So in the case of Treisman, what she showed was if you present objects really quickly and mask them, which messes with the encoding,
Okay, right. And you're
then you will
thinking
get.
about where the encoding's not been messed with.
Yeah, exactly. So the Treisman kind of illusory conjunctions where people miscombine the color and shape and so on, that doesn't really tell you whether or not the failure is due to anything about representational format or is like showing you anything about the format. But there's a lot of more recent evidence, past 15 years or so, in the visual working memory literature that shows that when the items are encoded with no masking, no rush presentation time, you can vary the presentation time and it doesn't make a difference. And then you hold on to them in visual working memory, that they erode independently. The
Okay.
features erode independently rather than as a package. So that's I think a nice piece of evidence for discrete constituents.
So why couldn't someone object, and maybe probably they have, that this is in working memory, therefore cognition and not just perception?
Yeah. As I said, I think like I'm happy to not get into that argument with someone for the purpose of the language of thought.
Okay.
But then if someone like Ned wants to say, sure, this is evidence for discrete constituents, but not in perception, then I would just point to evidence about how these object representations in visual working memory function. So the function that they play, the role that they have, is not primarily or uniquely to guide cognition. It's to guide vision.
Right.
So the visual system is tapping into these things constantly, all the time, and using them for things like making sense of the visual scene in front of you as your eyes are moving. So if you're playing basketball, say, um, and your eyes are moving all over the place, but you still have, if you're dribbling the ball or you're a defender looking at someone who has the ball, you're focally attending to the ball that whole time. That's, I think it would be a really radical shrinking of the visual system to think that the visual system is not sensitive to the continued identity of that ball as you're moving your head and moving your eyes. Um, as you're moving your head and moving your eyes, the evidence is extremely clear that visual working memory these very object representations in visual working memory are heavily relied on, including over short timescales, not even over like 5 seconds, but over like 500 milliseconds.
Right. So how does that address? So if you're someone like Ned, who defines access consciousness in terms of a state guiding behavior or used in rational thought, the guiding behavior is in there. But I assume that for Ned, global broadcasting is cognition. That once you've been globally broadcast, and I'm pretty sure he says this in his response to you, that what he means by the cognitive envelope is just the linking of the activity in the visual areas to the global workspace areas. In which case, doesn't that like answer this objection? Or I mean,
I don't think it does.
okay,
So like if you want to say that the visual system just never represents in this format, um, then why is it that the visual system seems to be constantly computing over these representations in order to maintain coherence across eye movements? Then you've got this picture. I mean, I'm just not really sure what the picture is, but it's a picture in which we have these object representations in visual working memory. They are completely different than any format that the visual system represents in. And yet the visual system is able to look at them at every moment and use them to maintain coherence across eye movements.
so maybe they're not
How does that
completely
work?
different because
Yeah.
that's the idea of the envelope. I mean, I don't mean to defend Ned too much, but I am just curious, and I don't. I'm joking. I would like to defend Ned. He's an interesting, smart philosopher, but I don't agree with him on this point. But his view, as far as I can tell, is that the cognitive enveloping the wrapper, which gets wrapped around it, is wrapped around that perceptual iconic format. So it's not completely different formats. Now the cognitive enveloping maybe is different, and maybe that's what your objection was tailored to. But like the whole thing is not radically different. It's got these parts, so one of which is different.
Yeah. I mean, it depends on how it works. So, I mean, one thing that seems to be true is that the low-level features and their persistent storage in visual working memory is precisely the evidence that I was appealing to in favor of discrete constituents. So it can't be the case then. If the story would be that the visual system, as it's constantly computing over these representations in visual working memory, it's just computing over the perceptual materials part and not the cognitive envelope part.
Right.
But the cognitive envelope part seems to, by hypothesis here, seems to include like the color and the orientation, and so all of these features. So how much information is really there in the format that the visual system is representing, and why would we want a picture on which? I mean, I get that there's like a philosophical view being defended here, but just trying to kind of putting aside the larger war about the format of perceptual representation, like why would you want to design a system where we have these representations of objects and the visual system is in the business of making coherent representations of the world across, several hundred milliseconds, consulting information in visual working memory, but it can't consult the color or orientation information?
Yeah.
It just seems to me that like once we just think about, does it make sense to design a system that works this way? The answer is no.
Yeah.
And it makes what I think makes more sense is the visual system constructs these representations in a format that it can put into visual working memory, and then that representation can face in both directions, so to speak. It can face cognition because it's got this discursive format that can be used by cognition, but the visual system can also access that discursive stuff too. So the visual system needs to be able to represent the world discursively, and it can also represent the world iconically for other purposes using different principles.
Yeah, I guess I'm sympathetic to that, but I guess I would only want to take it doesn't make sense to design a system like that so far, given that pretty much everything we've discovered so far about the way the brain operates has encountered that objection. So when the synapse was first discovered, they're like, it doesn't make sense. That can't be true. When the action potential was discovered, they're like, it doesn't make sense. Okay. So it's pretty much, you could trace all of these back and people are like, no, this can't be right, because it doesn't make sense. But no, it actually does when you get into the details. So I agree.
That's fair enough. But I just don't, in this case, we don't have that much positive evidence, right? So like, you're kind of like floating reasonably the idea that, oh yeah, sure, we have a lot of positive evidence that the visual system can access these object representations in visual working memory. But maybe what's going on is it's just the perceptual materials that are being accessed.
Yeah.
And so then just dialectically, I'm just kind of pointing out that, well, in terms of the evidence for discrete constituents, that includes all the useful low-level features. So we're going to have to exclude that. And then how useful is that remaining information really? So like, what is it explaining? And I agree, like if we had super direct positive evidence for this hypothesis, then that kind of a priori design question wouldn't be very powerful. I agree with you.
So, and also I want to add to this Ned's idea that there's kind of these non-conceptual, non-cognitive, iconic representations that you might call of a category or of a kind, which you might have thought were conceptual, but he says they aren't, proto-concepts or whatever that means. He was supposed to come on and talk to me about this stuff, but we had some snafu, so hopefully someday he will and I could ask him about this. But just if you add those kinds of things, then couldn't you have the view that the perceptual system is computing in its own language or own format those properties, which then have to be sort of enveloped by cognition to do all this other stuff, but there is a sort of way to preserve that is accessing that information.
Yeah, I guess the question is just, do we have evidence that, I mean, what would that look like, right? So if the discrete constituents, if you take the discrete constituents evidence on board, that what that shows is that individual features like color and orientation and other low-level features are being lost separately, so therefore represented with discrete constituents. So if that's evidence for discursive format, then it can't be any of that that's being accessed for perceptual purposes. And so would there be another way of representing that information in visual working memory that doesn't have that property and isn't showing up in these experiments? Or is the claim that the visual system does not have access to the features, just the objects and their locations or something like that? These are questions that I just don't know what the answers are.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
I see that we're running out of time and there's a trillion things I still want to ask you about. Plus I see some interesting questions in the chat, which I'm gonna torture you with. But I do wonder, like, this discrete, specifically the discrete part. I did see a talk that you gave recently at the Philosophy of Vision Society, organized by Jorge, and you had a commenter whose name I don't know how to pronounce, but you probably know her name and could
Yada
pronounce.
Shu.
Yes, exactly. And one of the points that she made was that the binding problem maybe needs to be superseded because we find neurons that encode like color and shape, and so they don't seem to come apart in the way that you suggest. So, and I didn't really hear your response to her in that discussion. I was curious what you might say to that kind of evidence, if you think it's relevant or if you think you have a response.
I think it's super relevant, but it's relevant to visual processing of a kind of earlier sort, and in the kind of scene-based form of processing. So Yada Shu is an author actually on a few studies that do a really good job of, I think, illustrating the idea that you do get kind of a deeper, more entangled form of composition of features in some forms of processing, but not in other forms of processing. And in particular, that this tracks the difference between focal attention to an object that goes into visual working memory, where you get more disentanglement, and scene-based processing, where I want to argue you have iconic representations that are composing features in a completely different way. So one piece of evidence that she and her collaborators, including Jonathan Kant, have found is that if you are processing a combination of features like shape and texture, if you're processing those in a single object way, then they don't interfere with each other. So like if you have to discriminate the shape, then messing with the texture does not mess with your performance and vice versa. So that's called like having separable features that are nonetheless being combined. But if you force people to attend to an entire display of objects, now if they have to discriminate the shape or the shape or the texture, messing with one of those properties does mess with the other. So shape and texture are being combined in a holistic way when you're processing a whole scene, but in a discrete way when you're processing an individual object. So I do want to take on...
That fits with your picture perfectly.
Exactly. So I think all the evidence that she was citing, which is really interesting evidence that you have entanglement of these features in the neurons, like, and she's also talking about neural evidence there, that this tracks the more like ventral iconic mode of processing and not the more dorsal single object way of processing.
Interesting. Okay, good. Very cool. So I do see some, I hear the bus pulling up outside, so I will have to bow out for child-related reasons. But before that, I see a question from the chat from a guy named Timothy, who I don't know, but they say, very interesting discussion. I'm just thinking, what does Jacob think about something like Papineau's epiphenomenalism argument against representationalism? He focuses on consciousness, but it's the same for any form of representationalism. Basically, if content is to make any causal difference, then the problem is there is something doing causal work that's not in the brain. The brain could be in the same neural state in different environments, and so with different contents. But if so, the idea that content makes a difference would mean the same neural states have different causal dispositions, which is in conflict with some other things. So yeah, I wonder if you have anything. Oh, there's a TLDR. General representationalism question. Papineau epiphenomenalism argument. Representationalism needs content to make causal difference. Content shouldn't make a difference if physicalism is true.
Yeah. I think I just agree with it.
Yeah.
So I agree that content is epiphenomenal.
Okay. So because it's about the vehicle's properties.
Yeah. So, and sorry, I keep accidentally cutting you off, by the way. I always do this on Zoom by accident.
I'm doing the same to you, so apologies back.
Okay. It's just there's something about the little lag that just completely destroys my manners. But yeah, I don't think that the contents of mental representations are causally efficacious. And I think it's really weird to think that they are. I mean, contents, it depends on how you think about contents, I guess. And this is how we started off, isn't it? By thinking about how the word content gets thrown around. But like, if you think of the contents as sets of possible worlds, or like, accuracy conditions.
Yeah, how could those do something?
Yeah, like how could they cause the psychological processing?
Right.
That's not an argument against there being mental representations, though. That's just an argument against mental representations playing like a special causal role. I guess I would wonder to what use Papineau is putting that. If that's like in the stuff from a few years ago on sensory consciousness, he might be using that as an argument against representationalism about phenomenal consciousness.
Yes.
And I have no commitment to representationalism about phenomenal consciousness
Bummer.
personally.
Too
Yeah, I
bad.
know that's where you and I might disagree.
Exactly.
But yeah, consciousness. Yeah,
But
that's tough.
by the way, I split my view between a flat-footed identity theory and representationalism, so I'm not like fully committed.
Okay, okay. And his view is closer to a flat-footed identity
Yes,
view, I think.
exactly.
So yeah, I don't know about that, but I just would want to agree that content is epiphenomenal. And I don't know, for some reason this seems to like people find this like a troubling consequence.
Yeah.
But to me it's not a troubling consequence at all. It's not like your thought is epiphenomenal. It's just the content part of the thought that's epiphenomenal. You have a thought that has some content, like I want to go to this conference. The thought that you want to go to some conference does cause you to engage in the planning that gets you there and book the ticket and so on, but not in respect of the content, in respect of some vehicle property that expresses the content. The content itself is epiphenomenal, but nonetheless, the generalization that ranges over the content that says when I want to go to a conference and nothing is prohibiting me, then I will. So to me, like epiphenomenalism about content just has no spooky or troubling anti-realist consequences.
Cool.
But
And
I might be
is this
weird.
so? I guess is this like channeling a Fodor type view where Fodor says, "Look, well, all you need to do is arrange the syntactic transformations so that they mirror the semantic ones, and you're done. You don't need any special semantic stuff going on."
Yeah, I guess certain time slices of Fodor,
Yeah.
like
Right.
early '80s Fodor.
Yeah.
That's the Fodor I really vibe with. The '90s Fodor, not so. He became much more hardcore realist about content intentionality and so
Yeah.
on. I should mention I kind of tend to have extremely radical views about this sort of issue. So one thing that has led me to this is thinking about polysemy, which is something that I've done some work on. That like, so you mentioned keep before, like you keep your promises, or you keep an appointment, or you keep, your office. Um, uh, the there might not be some relation out there in the world of keeping that's the same in all of those. And so, what is the mental representation, the concept of keeping? Well, it's not something that fixes some, it's not something that refers to something in the world. It's something that has um, a, an open-endedness in what it can be used to refer to. And something that I've argued for this kind of a view, but more recently in a collaboration with Eric Mandelbaum and Spencer Kaplan, who's a psycholinguist at the Grad Center. But really, the work was primarily done by Griffin Payan and Elliot Schwartz, who are two grad students in philosophy at CUNY. Um, uh, they ran some experiments trying to see how people evaluate logical arguments that equivocate on two different senses of a polysemous word. And so if you take a word like bank, where that can mean the financial institution or like a river bank, that would not be polysemy. That would be homonymy, where there's no underlying concept there. Those are just two different concepts.
Right.
If you they gave people arguments that equivocated on those two meanings and asked them to judge validity. So it'd be something like all banks are financial institutions. Many banks run alongside rivers, therefore. Many financial institutions run alongside rivers, something like that. And you ask people to judge validity. There, they judge them to be just as invalid as any obviously invalid argument. But if instead it trades on a polysemous word, so like all breakfasts are under 3 hours, so their breakfast refers to an event. Some smoothies are breakfasts, and their breakfast refers to a food, not an event.
Right.
And then the conclusion would be some smoothies are under 3 hours. That conclusion by itself does not sound very good.
Yeah.
But interestingly, people will judge that argument to be significantly more valid. And so what they found is that the underdetermined representation that's involved in polysemy is available for composing into a thought and running a logical inference over it. And so you're getting full-blown thought of the sort that's involved in logical inference with no propositional content. because you're exploiting this representation that doesn't refer to anything. This breakfast concept that is somehow neutral between events and concrete pieces of food.
Or they're just engaging in an invalid inference and not aware of it.
Right, but the point is that they're doing that for the polysemous representations and not for the homonymous ones.
Right.
So what explains the invalid inference? I agree the inference is invalid in terms of the propositions that are being expressed, but there's some underlying mental representation for breakfast that's the same, whether it's the event or the food, and they're able to use that in thought to perform a logical inference without picking a particular denotation.
Interesting. Yeah.
That's true that not only is content epiphenomenal, but you can think full-blown thoughts without having a content.
Yeah, okay. Wow, I think those are most of my thoughts. Okay, I mean, I want to follow up with a million things, but okay. So one other question from the chat, which is from Pooja Sony, who's a friend of the channel. If perception involves icons in general, which part of my perception of a dog in a park is a screen upon which the dog acts as the icon? Where does the boundary of a dog leave the boundary of a park or even of the sky?
I see. So by icon, I think that the person asking that question was thinking of an icon on a desktop, whereas I'm using it just to much more generally mean an image, like a picture is an icon. So just an iconic representation, meaning something that has an image-like structure. So it's not that the claim is not that when you're perceiving a scene like a dog in a park, that you've got a kind of icon of the dog and then the rest of the scene is functioning as a desktop. So it's less intuitive in a way than that. The claim is when you're representing the individual dog as it's running around, that's actually probably the aspect of your perception that is the least iconic. So what's iconic would be your encoding of the entire scene of the park around you that you're not focusing on at the moment, but your visual system has this very rich iconic representation. And then you have these much more highly structured language of thought-like representations that you're deploying for the particular objects that you're analyzing, like the dog that you're tracking as it runs around.
Yeah, so I maybe I'm mistaken, but I was interpreting the question to be about where the images are and what are they on. And I think you actually addressed this in some of your work where you're saying that you don't need to have an image in the brain for it to be image-like representations in there, as long as there's some sort of preservation of the things in the way that we have been discussing, such that you can decompose the parts and they represent that thing in holistic ways and so forth. So you don't really need a screen on which the image is projected or shown.
Right, I see. Yeah, that's true. The question that we're interested in here is the functional profile of data structures in the mind. And ultimately, this is realized in the brain. And you might even see that where you have this data structure that has a more image-like format as opposed to a more discursive format, that actually is instantiated in neural structures that look a little bit more like an image. And some people have argued this. In the case of visual perception, in the primary visual cortex, in the brain, you see image-like neural implementation. But that's not really what the hypothesis is about. It's not about the neural implementation. Right. It's about the functional level way in which data is encoded and made available for computation. So there doesn't, as you said, there doesn't need to be a screen. There doesn't need to be an internal perceiver or anything like that. We're just asking, how is information being made explicit for downstream computations?
So your view wouldn't be committed to like indirect realism or like some kind of screen of perception, veil of perception type view. You could be as direct realist as you want.
For sure. I mean, insofar as direct realism is compatible with mental representations,
right?
Which I think it is.
Yeah,
when you token a representation in your visual system in the right way, that makes you aware of the content out there in the world that is represented by the representation.
Yes, exactly. So final question here, follow up from Timothy, who says, wait, isn't what you said compatible with an activism? Which brings us full circle since we started talking about that beginning. But they wouldn't have to deny syntactic elements in the mind. They say, I'm really out of my depth here, but curious.
I mean, so classically, the people like the Gibsonians, I'm referring to J.J. Gibson there, and other kinds of inactivists, the argument has been against the internalistic component of representationalism, which says that there are these syntactic items that are compositional and that there are computations over them, um, and that instead what they want to say is there's just kind of brute physiological stuff going on in the brain, and then there's the embedded, relations to affordances and sensory motor contingencies and all of that. Um, More recently, there's been that work by Hutto that came up before that like kind of really attacks the content component of
Right.
representations and says like, oh, there's no theory of content, so this construct doesn't work, or content is epiphenomenal or whatever. Um, to me, that's fine. And so if that's the version of an activism that like if there's a version of an activism that's cool with syntactic structures and iconic format and language of thought format and all of that in perception, then great. I'm not aware of anyone that's like taking it in that direction, but then maybe that would apply to me and to certain time slices of Fodor and every time slice of Noam Chomsky and all these like apparently arch representationalists. But yeah,
Right. But so I mean, it does bring up in my just spiraling down the rabbit hole here. It does make me wonder about if you're like a really externalist minded 4E person, then the world has discrete elements. If I'm looking at a tree and part of my perception involves that tree, then doesn't that satisfy all of these things? Except maybe it's not a representation, it's a tree, but mentally interacting with it by naively perceiving it, maybe that makes it part of the perception. So it does seem like you could blur the lines a lot here if you wanted to apply these things in a larger scale and say, yeah, well, there's discrete elements and they can be combined in various ways. It's represented holistically, not represented, but this holistic thing. That part of the tree is just that part of it, et cetera. So you could get it. You could try to recapture a lot of what you're saying in that way, don't you? Or no? Or I mean, if you were a naive realist
I don't know.
and a 4E
Yeah,
person, which I'm not, but you know.
yeah, I don't know that. Yeah, I mean, the way that I'm thinking about it, all these structures have to be kind of immediately available for computation. And maybe you could say that the perceptual relation to the environment makes those properties immediately available. So on the view that we're talking about, like the tree itself would be like a sentence in the language of thought.
Yeah, or like an icon.
Yeah, that would be cool. I don't know what to say about
Yeah,
that.
exactly. Yeah.
But
More power to you, brother. Exactly.
yeah.
Okay, so I know I'm aware of the time here, and but last thing I want to ask you is whether there was something that you wanted to have come up, which hasn't come up in our discussion so far. The answer can be no, but I always like to check to see if there was anything you were wanting to talk about that we didn't get to.
I don't think so. This is pretty wide ranging. I was hoping to talk about the Polysemy stuff that Griffin and Ellie did because I'm really excited about that, but we did get to that. Yeah, no, not really.
Okay, very
I've really
cool.
enjoyed this conversation.
Yeah, I also very enjoyed this conversation. So thanks again, Jake, for coming by. And hopefully, I'll have you back once your book comes out. I know you must be working on a book at some point. Everyone is. That's the
No,
only thing I've learned. Oh, you're not?
I'm not ready. No, books are for sellouts.
Nice.
Is
Hey,
my
I just
is
published a
my
book. Damn it.
that's my stated view on the matter.
Okay, so then I'll remember that when your book does come out. On that note, thanks again for coming by. It's been a great conversation. Just hang around for 1 second. I'll say bye off the air. But in the meantime, thanks again, Jake.
Yeah, great to talk to you.
All right, we're free and